The gunshot echoed across the plains as Jane Ellison clutched her swollen belly, the pain unlike anything she'd felt before. Blood seeped through her cotton dress, staining the fabric a deep crimson as she collapsed against the broken wagon wheel. Rain poured mercilessly from the darkened sky, washing away the tracks of the bandits who had ambushed her traveling party just hours before. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Please don't take my baby too." In the distance, a silhouette emerged from the mist, the outline of a man on horseback. Jane reached for the small derringer hidden in her boot, her fingers trembling. After losing her husband and fellow travelers to the ruthless attack, she couldn't trust anyone. "Stay back," she warned, raising the pistol with what little strength remained. The figure slowed his approach, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Madam, I don't aim to hurt you. Looks like you could use some help." As he drew closer, Jane could make out his features beneath the wide brim of a weathered hat. His face was tan and leathered from years under the harsh western sun, but his eyes held a gentleness that contradicted his rugged appearance. "Name's Frank Calloway," he said, dismounting his horse with careful movements. "I heard gunfire from my cabin up yonder, came to see what the trouble was." Jane's arm wavered, the pistol suddenly too heavy to hold. As it dropped to her side, a sharp pain tore through her abdomen, forcing a cry from her lips. "The baby," she gasped, clutching her stomach. "It's coming, but something's wrong. There's blood, too much blood." Frank knelt beside her, assessing the situation with a grim expression. "We need to get you somewhere dry, madam. My cabin's not far." "My baby won't survive," Jane whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her face. The cowboy's eyes met hers, determination replacing concern. "Then we'll hope till morning," he whispered back, gently lifting her into his arms. The year was 1873, and the Colorado Territory was as beautiful as it was merciless. Frank had come west after the war between the states, seeking solitude and a fresh start. For 6 years, he'd lived alone in his small cabin nestled in the foothills, raising cattle and keeping to himself. He never expected to find a pregnant woman on the verge of death during a spring thunderstorm. The ride to his cabin was treacherous. Jane slipped in and out of consciousness, each jolt of the horse bringing fresh waves of pain. Frank held her securely against his chest, whispering reassurances as they traveled through the downpour. "Stay with me, madam," he urged whenever her eyes fluttered closed for too long. "What's your name?" "Jane," she managed between labored breaths. "Jane Ellison. My husband, Thomas." "The bandits shot him. Everyone's gone." Frank's jaw tightened. "The Blackwell gang's been terrorizing these parts. I'm sorry about your husband, Mrs. Ellison, but right now we need to focus on you and your little one." The cabin appeared through the curtain of rain, a humble structure built of sturdy logs with a small covered porch. Frank carried Jane inside and laid her gently on his bed, quickly lighting the lanterns and stoking the embers in the fireplace. "I'm not a doctor," he admitted, gathering clean cloths and his limited medical supplies. "But I've helped birth calves and horses, if you'll permit me to help you." Another contraction seized Jane, stronger than the last. She nodded through gritted teeth, having no alternative. "The baby's coming whether we're ready or not." Hours passed in a blur of pain and fear. Frank worked tirelessly, using the skills he'd learned from necessity rather than training. He heated water, cleaned the wound on Jane's side from a grazing bullet, and prepared as best he could for the delivery. "Push when you feel the need," he instructed, his usually confident voice betraying a hint of nervousness. He'd never delivered a human baby before, and the complications from Jane's injury made the situation even more precarious. Jane summoned strength she didn't know she possessed, bearing down with each contraction while fighting against the weakness from blood loss. "I can't lose this baby," she gasped. "It's all I have left of Thomas." As midnight approached, the storm intensified, rattling the windows of the small cabin. Jane's condition worsened, her face pale and glistening with sweat despite the chill in the air. "Frank," she whispered during a brief respite between contractions, using his given name for the first time. "If I don't make it, promise me you'll take care of my baby." The cowboy looked up from where he was preparing clean linens, his expression resolute. "That's not a promise I'll need to keep because you're going to make it, both of you." But as the night wore on, even Frank's determination began to waver. Jane was growing weaker and the baby seemed no closer to arriving. In a moment of desperate inspiration, Frank remembered an herbal remedy he'd once seen a Cheyenne woman use during a difficult birth. "Hold on," he told Jane, rushing to a small cabinet where he kept dried herbs and plants. He quickly prepared a tea using a mixture of blue cohosh and black haw, remedies known to strengthen contractions and ease bleeding. "Drink this," he urged, supporting her head as she sipped the bitter concoction. "An old Cheyenne woman showed me these herbs once, said they help mothers in trouble." Whether it was the herbs, Jane's determination, or simply the right time, the labor suddenly progressed rapidly. With one final, powerful push, Jane delivered her baby, a tiny girl with a shock of dark hair and lungs that proved remarkably strong as she announced her arrival with a piercing cry. "A daughter," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion as he quickly cleaned the infant and wrapped her in a soft flannel shirt. "You have a daughter, Mrs. Ellison." Jane reached for her baby with trembling arms, tears streaming down her face as Frank placed the swaddled infant against her chest. "Elizabeth," she whispered. "Her name is Elizabeth." Frank turned his attention to stopping Jane's bleeding, applying pressure and herbs known for their styptic properties. The bullet had grazed her side, missing vital organs but causing enough damage to complicate the birth. The night wasn't over yet. "Stay with me, Jane," he urged when her eyes began to close, exhaustion and blood loss threatening to pull her under. "Elizabeth needs you. Fight." Throughout the long night, Frank kept vigil, changing compresses and monitoring both mother and child. The baby nursed weakly when Jane was conscious enough to offer her breast, a good sign that gave them both hope. As dawn broke, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, Jane opened her eyes to find Frank asleep in a chair beside the bed, his hand still resting protectively on the edge of the mattress. The baby slumbered peacefully at her side, swaddled in clean linens. "We made it to morning," Jane whispered, causing Frank to stir. He blinked awake, relief flooding his features when he saw color had returned to her cheeks. "That you did," he replied with a tired smile. "Both of you." The days that followed established a tentative routine. Frank cared for his unexpected guests with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior, changing dressings on Jane's wound, hunting fresh game for nourishing broths, and even awkwardly rocking Elizabeth when Jane needed rest. "You're good with her," Jane observed one evening as Frank walked the fussy infant around the cabin, humming an off-key rendition of Beautiful Dreamer. Frank looked embarrassed. "Had 6 younger siblings back in Virginia, helped raise most of them after our pa died. What happened to them?" Jane asked, sitting up in bed, her strength gradually returning. A shadow crossed his face. "Lost 2 brothers at Gettysburg. Ma and the girls moved to St. Louis with my uncle after the war. I write when I can." Jane nodded, understanding the unspoken pain. The war had left few families untouched, regardless of which side they'd supported. "Why Colorado?" she asked. Frank walked to the window, gazing out at the mountains bathed in sunset. "Needed space to breathe, too many ghosts back east." He glanced down at Elizabeth, who had finally settled. "What about you? Where were you headed?" "Oregon," Jane replied. "Thomas had a cousin there with land, said we could build a new life." Her voice caught. "We sold everything to make the journey." Frank returned the now sleeping Elizabeth to her makeshift cradle, a drawer lined with soft blankets. "You're welcome to stay here until you're well enough to travel," he offered. "Though I can't promise it's much." "It's more than enough," Jane said softly. "You saved our lives, Frank Calloway. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." He shook his head. "No debt between us, Mrs. Ellison. Just glad I was nearby when you needed help." As weeks turned to months, Jane's wound healed completely, and Elizabeth thrived under their combined care. Jane took over cooking and mending, grateful to contribute something to their arrangement. Frank taught her to shoot his Winchester rifle, insisting she know how to protect herself and Elizabeth. "You're a natural," he commented after she hit 3 cans in succession from the porch. "Better aim than most men I know." Jane lowered the rifle, pleased with her progress. "Thomas never wanted me to touch firearms, said they weren't ladylike." Frank raised an eyebrow. "With respect to your late husband, madam, survival ain't about being ladylike." The summer passed in a comfortable rhythm. Frank worked his small cattle herd and tended the vegetable garden, while Jane kept the cabin and cared for Elizabeth. They rarely discussed the future, each day passing with the unspoken understanding that eventually Jane would need to decide whether to continue to Oregon as planned or forge a different path. The question came to a head in early autumn, when a letter arrived from the nearest town. Frank had ridden in for supplies and returned with the correspondence from Jane's sister-in-law in St. Louis, who had been listed as next of kin on their wagon train registry. "She thinks I'm dead," Jane said quietly after reading the letter. "They found the wagon train, or what was left of it." No survivors were reported. Frank set down the crate of supplies he'd been unpacking. "Will you write to her?" Jane folded the letter carefully. "Yes, but—" She hesitated, looking around the cabin that had become home. "Frank, I need to ask you something." He nodded, waiting. "Would it be imposing if Elizabeth and I stayed through the winter? The mountain passes will be dangerous soon, and she's still so small." Jane's words tumbled out quickly, revealing her anxiety. Relief washed over Frank's face. "Mrs. Ellison, Jane, you and Elizabeth are welcome to stay as long as you wish. Truth be told, I've grown accustomed to the company." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in Jane's arms, a comfortable silence enveloped them. The changing leaves painted the landscape in brilliant golds and reds, and a cool breeze carried the promise of winter. "I never thought I'd feel peaceful again," Jane admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought my life was over too." Frank studied her profile, admiring the quiet strength she possessed. "Life has a way of continuing even when we think it can't." "Yes," she agreed, meeting his gaze. "Sometimes in ways we never expected." The moment lingered between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Frank cleared his throat and looked away first, mindful of her recent widowhood and the propriety of their arrangement. "I should check the livestock before dark," he said, standing abruptly. Jane nodded, understanding his retreat. Her own conflicted feelings had grown increasingly difficult to ignore. Thomas had been a good husband, if somewhat rigid in his expectations. Their marriage had been one of mutual respect rather than passion. But her feelings for Frank were something altogether different, born of shared hardship and daily intimacies that created bonds stronger than she'd anticipated. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the foothills in deep snow by mid-November. The cabin, though small, remained warm and snug with the constant attention to the fireplace. Frank added a lean-to for additional storage and moved his sleeping quarters there, giving Jane and Elizabeth privacy in the main cabin. Christmas approached, bringing with it memories of family traditions and celebrations now lost. Frank noticed Jane's melancholy and decided to surprise her. While out hunting one morning, he cut down a small pine tree and dragged it back to the cabin. "What's this?" Jane asked when he propped it in the corner. "Thought Elizabeth should have a proper Christmas tree for her first Christmas," he explained, suddenly self-conscious. "My ma always said no matter how little we had, we could afford to celebrate the season." Jane's eyes welled with tears. "It's perfect, thank you." They decorated the tree with strings of dried berries, pine cones, and small carved wooden figures that Frank whittled in the evenings. Jane fashioned a star from scraps of tin, and together they created a modest but beautiful holiday centerpiece. On Christmas Eve, after Elizabeth was asleep, they sat before the fire sharing a precious cup of whiskey Frank had been saving for a special occasion. I have something for you, Jane said, retrieving a package wrapped in brown paper from her trunk. It isn't much. Frank carefully unwrapped the gift to find a hand-knitted scarf made from wool yarn Jane had unraveled from one of her old sweaters and re-dyed using berries and plants. "When did you make this?" he asked, running his fingers over the intricate pattern. "While you were out with the cattle." "Do you like it?" Frank wrapped the scarf around his neck, deeply touched by the gesture. "It's the finest gift I've received in many years." He reached into his pocket and produced a small wooden box. "This is for you." Inside, Jane found a delicate pendant carved from antler bone, a small wildflower etched into its surface and polished to a soft gleam. It hung from a leather cord. "Frank, it's beautiful," she whispered, immediately slipping it over her head. "Reminded me of you," he said simply. Strong but gentle, surviving where others might not. Their eyes met over the dancing flames, and this time neither looked away. Frank slowly reached out, his calloused hand gently covering hers. Jane turned her palm upward, their fingers intertwining. "Jane," he said, his voice low. "I know it hasn't been long since Thomas." 8 months, she replied quietly. "The longest and shortest months of my life," Frank nodded. "I don't want to dishonor his memory or rush you, but I need you to know that I care for you and Elizabeth, deeply." Jane's heart pounded in her chest. "We care for you too, Frank." He squeezed her hand gently. "When spring comes, if you still want to go to Oregon, I'll help you get there safely. But if you'd consider staying." He took a deep breath. "This place hasn't felt like home until you and Elizabeth were in it." Tears spilled down Jane's cheeks as emotions she'd been holding back finally broke free. "I don't want to leave," she admitted. "Not ever." Frank reached up to brush away her tears with his thumb, his touch lingering on her cheek. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle and questioning at first, then deepened as Jane responded, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you in that storm," he murmured. "I never expected to live through it," she replied. "You gave us a second chance at life, Frank Calloway. And you gave me a reason to truly live again, Jane Ellison." Their newfound understanding brought both joy and complications. Jane struggled with guilt over her feelings, wondering if she was betraying Thomas's memory by falling in love so soon after his death. Frank, sensing her inner conflict, gave her space while continuing to care for them both. In January, a week of brutal blizzards isolated the cabin completely. When the storms finally subsided, Frank ventured out to check his cattle, finding several had perished despite his best efforts to shelter them. "This changes things," he told Jane grimly after returning. "We'll have enough to get through winter, but the herd's too small now to sustain us next year." Jane sat beside him at the table, Elizabeth babbling happily in her lap. "What are our options?" Frank ran a hand through his hair, still damp from the snow. "We could sell what's left come spring and try ranching somewhere else, or I could look for work in town." "There's a third option," Jane said carefully. "My sister-in-law wrote again. Thomas's cousin in Oregon still has that land offer open, says it would be enough for a decent-sized ranch." Frank studied her face. "Is that what you want, Oregon?" Jane reached for his hand. "What I want is a life with you, wherever that may be, but Oregon offers land we could never afford here." The decision wasn't made lightly. They spent weeks discussing possibilities, weighing options, and planning for various contingencies. In the end, the promise of their own substantial property in Oregon's fertile valleys proved too significant to dismiss. As February turned to March, and the first signs of spring appeared in the melting snowdrifts and budding trees, Frank and Jane formalized their intentions. They rode into the nearest town, where the local justice of the peace performed a simple ceremony with only the justice's wife and the general store owner as witnesses. "You're sure this isn't too soon?" Frank asked the night before their wedding, concerned about how others might judge Jane. She touched the antler pendant that never left her neck. "I'm certain. Life out here is too precarious to waste time worrying about what others think is proper. Thomas would want me and Elizabeth to be happy and protected." Their wedding night was spent in the same cabin where they had first come together, but with a new sense of permanence and promise. Frank's tenderness as a lover revealed yet another layer to the man who had already shown such care as a protector and provider. "I love you, Jane Calloway," he whispered as they lay tangled together in the darkness. She smiled against his chest, the new name settling around her like a comfortable blanket. "And I love you, Frank Calloway." April brought the final preparations for their journey. They sold Frank's remaining cattle to a neighboring rancher and packed their modest belongings into a sturdy wagon Frank had traded for. Elizabeth, now 10 months old and attempting her first steps, watched the activity with curious eyes. "Da." She called one morning, reaching her arms toward Frank as he loaded supplies. Both adults froze, turning to stare at the little girl bouncing excitedly in her makeshift playpen. "Did she just?" Frank began, his voice catching. Jane nodded, tears springing to her eyes. "She called you Da." Frank crossed to Elizabeth in 2 long strides, scooping her up and spinning her around. "That's right, little one," he whispered against her dark curls. "I'm your Da." The moment sealed what legal documents and ceremony had already established. They were a family, bound by love rather than blood. Their departure from the cabin was bittersweet. Frank had carved their initials into one of the porch posts, a permanent marker of the lives that had intertwined there. "Ready for our next adventure, Mrs. Calloway?" he asked, as he helped Jane and Elizabeth onto the wagon seat. Jane took one last look at the small structure that had witnessed so much in less than a year: birth and healing, grief and new love. "Ready, Mr. Calloway." The journey to Oregon was not without challenges. Spring storms, river crossings, and the general hardships of trail life tested their resilience. But unlike Jane's first westward journey, this one held hope rather than desperation. They traveled with a small wagon train for safety, though Jane initially worried about how others would react to their situation. She needn't have concerned herself. Life on the frontier had taught most settlers that judgment was a luxury few could afford. A woman with a baby needed a husband, and if the timing seemed convenient rather than conventional, no one commented openly. Frank proved to be a natural leader, helping other families with wagon repairs and hunting fresh game for the communal meals. Jane's knowledge of medicinal herbs, expanded from what Frank had taught her, made her equally valuable to the traveling party. "You two seem made for this life," remarked an elderly woman traveling to join her son's family. "Some folks just naturally know how to survive out here." "We've had practice," Jane replied simply, bouncing Elizabeth on her hip. As they crossed into Oregon territory nearly 2 months later, the landscape changed dramatically. Lush valleys and dense forests replaced the open plains and mountains they'd known in Colorado. The land promised by Thomas's cousin exceeded their expectations: 160 acres of fertile soil with a natural spring and enough timber to build a substantial home. "What do you think?" Frank asked as they stood surveying their new property, the wagon parked on what would become their front yard. Jane took in the sweeping view of meadows backed by distant mountains. "I think Elizabeth will need siblings to help work all this land someday," she said with a meaningful smile. Frank's eyes widened, then crinkled with joy as he understood her implication. "Mrs. Calloway, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Dr. Miller in the last town confirmed it. She nodded. "Come winter, Elizabeth will have a brother or sister." Frank whooped with delight, lifting Jane off her feet and spinning her around before setting her down gently, suddenly concerned. "Is this safe for you and the baby? After last time?" Jane placed her hand on his cheek. "Last time I was shot and delivering alone in a thunderstorm. This time will be different." And it was. Their first years in Oregon brought the prosperity that had eluded them in Colorado. Frank's ranching skills translated well to their new land, and Jane's garden produced abundantly. They built a proper home with enough bedrooms for their growing family. as Jane delivered a healthy son that winter, followed by twin girls 2 years later. Elizabeth grew into a strong, independent girl who called Frank Pa and knew only that her birth father had been a good man who died bravely. On her 6th birthday, Jane gave her the wedding band that had once belonged to Thomas, preserved as a connection to her heritage. "Your father would be proud of the girl you're becoming," Jane told her, "and so am I." 10 years after that desperate night when a storm brought them together, Frank and Jane stood on the porch of their Oregon home, watching their children play in the summer twilight. Elizabeth, now nearly 11, supervised her younger siblings with natural authority. 7-year-old James chased the 5-year-old twins, Mary and Margaret, their laughter carrying across the prosperous homestead. "You ever think about that night?" Jane asked, leaning against her husband's sturdy frame, Frank's arm tightened around her waist. "Often. I remember how afraid I was that I'd lose you both. I was certain we wouldn't survive till morning," Jane admitted, "but you gave me hope when I had none left. And you gave me a family when I thought I'd always be alone," Frank replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Seems we saved each other." As darkness settled over their land and they called the children in for supper, Jane reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a blood-soaked night of desperation to this life of abundance and love, their story had been one of hope redeemed and promises kept. Elizabeth ran ahead into the house, her siblings trailing behind her. Frank paused at the doorway, extending his hand to Jane. "Coming inside, Mrs. Calloway?" he asked, his smile still holding the same tenderness it had that first morning when they'd survived against all odds. Jane took his hand, just as she had so many times since. "Always," she replied, stepping into the warmth of the home and family they had built together.